My name is Margaret Thompson, and this is my story. If you'd asked me a year ago where I saw myself now, I wouldn't have said lying in a hospital bed feeling like the world had crumbled around me. But here I am, staring at the cracked ceiling tiles of St. Vincent's Hospital, trying to piece together how it all went wrong, or maybe how it all began to go right. Let me start from the beginning, because every story deserves its roots. My name is Margaret Thompson, and for as long as I can remember, my life has revolved around one person, my son Daniel. Daniel is 35 years old, and he was born with Down syndrome. People often ask me if raising him alone after my husband died when Daniel was just 5 felt overwhelming. Honestly, it did, but it also filled me with purpose. We live in a quiet suburb outside Chicago, our little corner of the world where we've built a life full of small joys. Every morning, I take a walk through the park near our house while Daniel stays back, working on his latest painting or tinkering with puzzles. He loves art more than anything else, and sometimes I think his soul speaks clearer through colors than words ever could. But even in this peaceful bubble we've created, there are cracks. Neighbors smile politely but whisper behind closed doors. Isn't it time she let him move into assisted living? They say. Or worse. He's such a sweet boy, but what kind of burden must that be for her? Burden. That word cuts deep every time I hear it, though I pretend it doesn't. Because the truth is, Daniel isn't a burden. He's my heart walking outside my body. Still, those whispers creep into your mind late at night when you're too tired to fight them off. They make you question everything, even yourself. I always thought I'd raised Daniel to be independent. He works part-time at the community center down the street, sorting books and helping set up events. The staff adores him. Kids light up when he greets them with a signature wave. On weekends, he spends hours painting landscapes inspired by the photos we take during our walks. His favorite subject? Trees. Big, towering oaks with sprawling branches that seem to hold up the sky itself. When he finishes a piece, he signs it proudly. By Daniel T. And then he looks at me expectantly, waiting for my verdict. But lately, something's shifted. Maybe it's age catching up to me. I turned 68 last spring. Or maybe it's just the weight of carrying so much for so long. Either way, I've been feeling off. Fatigue clings to me like an old sweater I can't shake off, no matter how many cups of coffee I drink. Daniel notices, of course. He always does. One day, I found a sticky note stuck to the bathroom mirror. Mom, you look tired. Rest, please. Another appeared on the fridge. Love you forever. Those notes broke my heart and stitched it back together all at once. How do you explain to someone who sees the world in such pure, simple terms that life isn't always easy? That some days, loving someone means carrying burdens neither of you asked for? Still, I kept pushing forward. Until the afternoon I collapsed in the garden. It happened so suddenly, yet somehow it felt inevitable. I was kneeling in the dirt, pulling weeds from around the rose bushes Daniel planted for me 2 summers ago. The sun hung low in the sky, casting golden shadows across the yard. Everything seemed normal until it wasn't. One moment, I was humming along to the birdsong, and the next, the ground rushed up to meet me. Darkness swallowed me whole before I could even call out for help. When I came to, Daniel was crouched beside me, his face pale and streaked with tears. Mom! Mom! He cried, shaking my shoulder gently. I tried to reassure him, telling him I was fine, but the fear in his eyes told me otherwise. I waved off a suggestion to call an ambulance, insisting it was just dehydration or exhaustion. Stubbornness runs in the family, apparently. But over the next few days, I couldn't shake the lingering weakness in my chest or the nagging feeling that something was seriously wrong. That's when the guilt started creeping in. Guilt for ignoring my own health, guilt for being selfish enough to think I could handle everything on my own. What would happen to Daniel if something happened to me? Who would take care of him? Who would love him the way I do? These questions haunted me as I lay awake at night, staring at the shadows dancing on my bedroom wall. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that I might not always be here for him. And that terrified me. Raising Daniel hasn't been easy, but it's been worth every sleepless night, every sacrifice, every ounce of energy I've poured into making sure he has the best life possible. I gave up dating after my husband passed away, not because I didn't want companionship, but because I couldn't imagine bringing someone new into our delicate ecosystem. Our bond is sacred, untouchable by anyone who doesn't understand the depth of it. Yet, there are moments when loneliness creeps in. Like during holidays, when other families gather around tables laden with food and laughter, and I sit across from Daniel, wondering if he feels the absence of a father figure the same way I do. Or, when well-meaning friends suggest I should really think about retirement homes for Daniel, as if he were a problem to be solved rather than a person to be cherished. Each comment stings, but I swallow it down, reminding myself that their opinions don't define us. At least, that's what I tell myself. Deep down, though, those voices seep into my mind, planting seeds of doubt I'm not ready to confront. Until now, looking back, I should have known better. There were signs, subtle ones, easy to dismiss if you didn't want to face reality. The persistent cough that lingered long after flu season ended. The shortness of breath whenever I climbed the stairs. Even the dull ache in my chest that flared up occasionally, only to fade again. But denial is a powerful thing. I convinced myself it was nothing more than aging, the natural wear and tear of a body that had carried too much for too long. After all, I didn't have time to focus on myself. Not when Daniel needed me. Then came the second collapse. This time, it wasn't in the privacy of our backyard, it was in the middle of the grocery store. I remember reaching for a carton of milk, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, when suddenly the world tilted sideways. Voices blurred together as strangers surrounded me, calling for paramedics. Through the haze, I heard Daniel's voice above the chaos. "Please don't hurt my mom." I wanted to tell him I was okay, that everything would be all right, but the words caught in my throat. By the time the ambulance arrived, I was barely conscious. Waking up in the hospital was like stepping into a nightmare. Tubes snaked across my body, machines beeped incessantly, and doctors spoke in hushed tones about procedures and surgeries. I learned I had a severe heart condition requiring immediate intervention. Recovery would take months, if I made it through it all. The thought of leaving Daniel alone during that time sent panic coursing through my veins. Who would step up for him? Who would protect him from the judgmental stares and cruel words of people who didn't understand him? That's when I called Carolyn, my sister. She's always been practical to a fault, the kind of person who believes emotions cloud judgment. Part of me hoped she'd surprise me, offer to take Daniel in temporarily, prove that blood still meant something. Instead, she hesitated, her voice laced with thinly veiled irritation. "Margaret, you know how much work he is," she said finally. Work. That single word echoed in my ears, cutting deeper than any insult ever could. As if loving your child, caring for them, was supposed to feel like a chore. In that moment, I realized just how alone Daniel and I truly were. I'll never forget the sterile whiteness of that hospital room, the way it seemed to swallow all warmth, leaving only cold reality behind. The doctor, a kind-eyed man named Dr. Patel, pulled up a chair beside my bed and explained the situation in careful, measured tones. "Your heart is under significant strain," he said, pointing to an X-ray on the screen. "We need to operate as soon as possible, but recovery will be challenging." His words blurred together, each one hitting me like a punch to the gut. What struck me most wasn't the severity of my condition, it was the part where he emphasized I wouldn't be able to care for Daniel during recovery. "You'll need someone reliable to step in," he added gently. Reliable. That word stuck in my mind like a splinter. Who exactly would that person be? My sister Carolyn had already made her feelings crystal clear. Friends. They were polite enough when we crossed paths at church or library events, but none had ever offered more than surface-level support. As the weight of his words settled over me, tears pricked the corners of my eyes. For the first time in decades, I felt utterly powerless. Later that evening, Daniel came to visit me in the hospital. He shuffled into the room holding a bouquet of daisies wrapped in crinkled brown paper, a gift from the community center garden. Seeing him there, clutching those flowers like they held the secret to fixing everything, broke something inside me. "Hi, Mom," he said softly, placing the bouquet on the bedside table. Then, without hesitation, he reached for my hand and squeezed it tightly. "Are you scared?" he asked after a long pause. His voice was small, almost childlike, yet filled with an understanding far beyond his years. I wanted to lie, to tell him everything would be okay, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Instead, I nodded and whispered a little. To my surprise, he smiled faintly. "Don't worry," he said. I'll take care of you. Those simple words hit harder than any diagnosis ever could. Here I was, lying in a hospital bed feeling sorry for myself, while my son, the one everyone dismissed as a burden, was offering to carry me. It was humbling, heartbreaking, and beautiful all at once. By the next morning, desperation had set in. I knew I couldn't leave Daniel entirely on his own while I recovered, so I swallowed my pride and dialed Carolyn's number again. She answered on the third ring, her tone clipped and impatient. "Margaret, I'm busy," she snapped before I even finished greeting her. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "Carolyn, please. I need your help, just until I'm back on my feet." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, followed by a heavy sigh. "Fine," she relented reluctantly. "But don't expect miracles." When Carolyn arrived at the hospital later that day, she barely glanced at me before launching into a tirade about how inconvenient this whole situation was. "Honestly, Margaret, you should have thought about this sooner," she muttered, pacing the room. "You can't keep putting yourself through this. Daniel deserves better. He needs professional care." Her words stung, but what hurt the most was the dismissive glance she gave Daniel when he walked in carrying another handmade card for me. "He's sweet," she admitted grudgingly. "But let's face it, he's too much for anyone to handle alone." I didn't realize Carolyn had continued talking after Daniel stepped out to grab a soda from the vending machine. Or maybe I chose not to hear her at first, hoping against hope that she'd soften her stance. But then her voice carried through the partially closed door, sharp and unforgiving. "A burden, plain and simple," she was saying to someone, probably her husband, on the phone. "She acts like she's some kind of saint for raising him, but honestly, it's selfish. She won't let anyone else step in because she wants to play martyr." Each word felt like a knife, twisting deeper into my chest. I lay there, frozen, pretending to sleep, so she wouldn't know I'd hurt her. Tears streamed silently down my cheeks as anger and sadness warred within me. How could she say those things about Daniel? About us? Didn't she see how hard we'd worked to build a life together, despite every obstacle thrown our way? When Daniel returned, smiling brightly and showing me the soda he'd bought, I forced a smile back, determined not to let him see how shattered I felt. But inside, I was crumbling. That night, after Carolyn left, promising vaguely to figure something out, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying her words over and over in my head. Was I being selfish? Had I failed Daniel by clinging to him so tightly? These thoughts gnawed at me until I couldn't stand them anymore. By dawn, I'd resolved to try reaching out to others, even if it meant swallowing my pride further. First, I called Mrs. Harper, an old colleague from my teaching days who'd always been kind to Daniel. Then, I messaged a few acquaintances from the library book club. Each conversation ended the same way. Polite sympathy, vague promises to think about it, but ultimately no real commitment. It wasn't their fault, really. Life gets busy, priorities shift, and people have their own struggles to deal with. Still, each rejection felt like another blow, chipping away at what little confidence I had left. By the time evening rolled around, exhaustion weighed heavily on me, not just physical, but emotional. I scrolled through my contacts list one last time, half-heartedly considering names I hadn't tried yet. And that's when I saw it, Liam Harper's number. I'd met him briefly at a community event a few months ago. He was a social worker specializing in supporting families like ours. At the time, I'd brushed off his offer to help, convinced I didn't need anyone meddling in our lives. Now, though, I wondered if maybe, just maybe, he might be worth a shot. Calling Liam felt like admitting defeat, which made it surprisingly difficult. I hesitated for nearly 10 minutes, staring at the phone as if it might bite me. Finally, I pressed dial, bracing myself for disappointment. To my relief, Liam answered almost immediately, his voice warm and reassuring. "Mrs. Thompson, how are you holding up?" he asked after exchanging pleasantries. I hesitated, unsure how to frame my request without sounding desperate. "Actually, Liam," I began haltingly, "I think I need your help." There was a brief pause before he responded. "Of course, Margaret. Tell me what's going on." So I did. I told him about my diagnosis, Carolyn's betrayal, and the overwhelming sense of isolation creeping in. To his credit, Liam listened patiently, asking thoughtful questions and offering gentle encouragement. By the time we hung up, I felt a flicker of hope, A fragile, tentative thing, but hope nonetheless. Maybe, just maybe, fate really did have other plans for us. The next morning, Liam showed up at the hospital with a notebook in hand and a calm demeanor that immediately put me at ease. He introduced himself to Daniel, who eyed him cautiously from behind his ever-present sketchpad. "Hi, Daniel," Liam said warmly, extending a hand. "I've heard so much about your paintings. Your mom tells me you're incredibly talented." Daniel glanced at me for confirmation, and when I nodded encouragingly, he shook Liam's hand shyly. It was a small moment, but it meant the world to me, seeing someone treat Daniel not as a burden or a project, but as a person. Once Daniel retreated to his corner of the room to draw, Liam pulled up a chair beside my bed. "Okay, Margaret," he began, flipping open his notebook. "Let's talk logistics. How can I best support both of you during this time?" His practical approach grounded me, reminding me that while emotions were running high, there were concrete steps we could take to navigate this mess. We discussed temporary housing options for Daniel, potential caregivers, and even ways to involve the community. For the first time in days, I felt like I had an ally, a partner in figuring out how to keep our family intact despite everything working against us. Over the next few days, Liam became a constant presence in our lives. He visited daily, bringing updates on resources he'd found and gently nudging me toward accepting help. At first, I resisted. I hated the idea of strangers stepping into our carefully constructed bubble, but Liam's persistence wore me down. One afternoon, as Daniel napped in the chair beside me, Liam leaned forward and said, "Margaret, let me ask you something. Would you rather have people step in now to ensure Daniel thrives, or wait until you're forced to make decisions under pressure later?" His words hit home. He wasn't trying to replace me. He was trying to protect what mattered most to me. Slowly, reluctantly, I started letting him take the reins. By the end of the week, Liam had arranged for Daniel to stay temporarily with a trusted foster family experienced in supporting adults with disabilities. They lived just 10 minutes away, which meant I could still see him regularly once I was discharged. It wasn't ideal. It would never be ideal, but it was a solution born out of necessity and compassion. And though part of me balked at the idea of Daniel living anywhere without me, another part whispered that maybe, just maybe, this could work. The day Daniel moved in with the foster family was one of the hardest of my life. Watching him pack his belongings into a duffel bag, his favorite hoodie, his box of colored pencils, the stuffed bear he'd had since childhood, felt surreal. "It's only for a little while," I reminded him, trying to sound cheerful despite the lump in my throat. He nodded solemnly, clutching his sketchpad to his chest like a lifeline. When Liam arrived to pick him up, Daniel hugged me tightly, whispering, "I'll miss you, Mom." At first, adjusting to the separation was brutal for both of us. Every phone call left me feeling guilty, convinced I should be doing more. Meanwhile, Daniel struggled with the change in routine. He missed our nightly walks and the familiar comfort of home. But Liam checked in frequently, updating me on Daniel's progress and reassuring me that these struggles were normal. Gradually, Daniel began settling in. The foster parents, a kind couple named Sarah and Mark, encouraged him to explore new hobbies and introduced him to their dog, Max, who quickly became his shadow. Hearing Daniel laugh during video calls gave me hope, even as loneliness gnawed at me in the hospital. While Daniel adapted to his new surroundings, I faced challenges of my own. Recovery was slower than expected, and the physical toll of surgery left me weak and frustrated. Simple tasks like brushing my hair or eating required monumental effort, and every setback felt like a personal failure. Worse still was the mental toll, the gnawing fear that I'd made the wrong decision by letting Daniel go. Nights were the hardest. Lying alone in my hospital bed, I replayed memories of our life together, teaching him to ride a bike, cheering him on at school plays, watching him paint sunsets that seemed to glow with pure joy. Without him here, those moments felt distant, almost dreamlike. But then there were the mornings when Liam would stop by with coffee and updates. "Daniel painted Max yesterday," he told me once, grinning. Apparently, Max didn't sit still long enough for a proper portrait, but Daniel thinks it turned out great anyway. Stories like that kept me going, reminding me that Daniel was okay, that we were okay. Even in the darkest moments, they gave me something to hold on to. One evening, Liam brought me a photo of Daniel standing proudly beside a painting he'd completed at the foster home. It was a vibrant depiction of Max chasing a butterfly, the colors bold and joyful. Beneath it, Daniel had written, "Max is happy because he has friends." Tears filled my eyes as I stared at the image. This wasn't just art, it was communication. Through his brushstrokes, Daniel was telling me he was finding happiness in his new environment. That night, I called him to praise the painting, and for the first time in weeks, I heard genuine excitement in his voice. "Do you think I could sell it?" he asked shyly. My heart swelled. "Absolutely," I replied. "Your art deserves to be seen by everyone." Encouraged by Daniel's growing confidence, Liam suggested enrolling him in an art therapy program at the community center. At first, I hesitated. Daniel had always preferred solitary activities, but Liam assured me the class was designed specifically for neurodivergent individuals. "It's a safe space," he explained. "He'll meet others who share his passion." Reluctantly, I agreed. To my surprise, Daniel loved it. Each session sparked new ideas, and soon he was bringing home pieces inspired by his classmates' work. For the first time, I saw glimpses of independence blossoming within him, not because I pushed him, but because he was discovering it on his own. As Daniel flourished, so did I in unexpected ways. Physical therapy sessions grew easier, and though recovery remained slow, I found solace in small victories. Walking down the hallway without assistance, eating a full meal without nausea. These milestones may have seemed insignificant to others, but to me, they were proof that I was fighting my way back to Daniel. More importantly, I started allowing myself to lean on Liam and the support system he'd helped build around us. Friends from the library sent cards and meals. Former students dropped by to visit, sharing stories of how I'd inspired them. Even Mrs. Harper surprised me with a quilt she'd sewn herself, embroidered with the words, "Stronger Together." Their kindness reminded me that while Carolyn and others might judge us, there were still good people willing to stand by us. For the first time in years, I let myself accept help without guilt, and it changed everything. Just when I thought things were finally falling into place, Carolyn decided to reinsert herself into the chaos. She stormed into my hospital room one afternoon, her face flushed with indignation. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" she demanded, slamming her purse onto the bedside table. I blinked, caught off guard. "What are you talking about?" "You know damn well what I'm talking about," she snapped. This circus you've created with that social worker. Letting strangers interfere in family matters. Dragging Daniel into some artsy-fartsy nonsense. It's irresponsible, Margaret. You're setting him up for failure." Her words hit me like a slap, but instead of shrinking back, I felt anger bubbling to the surface. "Setting him up for failure?" I repeated, incredulous. "Or setting him up for success? Because guess what, Carolyn, he's thriving. He's making friends, creating art, and learning to adapt in ways I never thought possible. Maybe it's time you stopped seeing him as a problem to be solved and started seeing him as a person." For a moment, Carolyn looked stunned. Then her expression hardened. "Don't lecture me about seeing him as a person," she shot back. "I'm just being realistic. He needs structure, stability, things you clearly can't provide anymore." Her tone dripped with condescension, but I refused to let her undermine me. "Not this time. I won't argue with you," I said firmly. "You're entitled to your opinion, but I won't let you dictate how I raise my son. If you can't support us, fine. But don't expect me to bow to your judgment anymore." Her jaw tightened, and for a second, I thought she might lash out further. Instead, she grabbed her purse and stormed out, muttering under her breath. As the door clicked shut behind her, I sank back against my pillows, exhausted but triumphant. For the first time in years, I'd stood up to Carolyn, and it felt incredible. Just as I thought we'd weather the worst of the storm, another challenge reared its ugly head: money. The hospital bills arrived in waves, each envelope thicker than the last. Every time I opened one, my stomach churned. Between the surgery, medications, and ongoing therapy, the costs were astronomical. My savings account dwindled faster than I could keep track, and panic began to creep in. What would happen if I couldn't afford proper care for myself or Daniel? Would all the progress we'd made unravel because of something as mundane, and yet devastating, as finances? Liam noticed my growing anxiety during one of his visits. "Margaret," he said gently, pulling up a chair beside me, "you don't have to face this alone. There are programs and grants available for families like yours." He pulled out a folder stuffed with pamphlets and forms, explaining how disability support services and Medicaid waivers might ease the burden. But bureaucracy has never been my strong suit, and the thought of navigating endless paperwork while still recovering filled me with dread. Still, Liam promised to guide me through it step by step. "We'll figure it out together," he assured me. Those words brought some comfort, but they didn't erase the looming fear that even the best intentions might not be enough. That night, unable to sleep, I stared at the pile of bills on my bedside table. Each number felt like a brick weighing me down, threatening to crush the fragile hope I'd managed to rebuild. Yet amidst the despair, a memory surfaced, a conversation I'd had with Daniel years ago when he was struggling in school. "Mom," he'd asked, tears streaming down his face, "what if I'm not smart enough?" I'd hugged him tightly and replied, "Smart isn't just about grades, sweetheart. It's about finding your own way to shine." In that moment, lying awake in the dark, I realized I needed to take my own advice. Maybe I couldn't control everything. Maybe I couldn't fix all the problems piling up around us, but I could find a way to shine through them. With Liam's help, I started tackling the applications one by one, filling out forms late into the night. It was exhausting, frustrating, and often demoralizing, but each completed document felt like a tiny victory. And slowly, incrementally, I began to believe that perhaps we'd make it through after all. Recovery wasn't linear. It came in fits and starts, 2 steps forward followed by 3 steps back. One particularly grueling week, I suffered complications from the surgery that landed me back in intensive care. The doctors reassured me it was temporary, but lying there hooked up to machines again felt like slipping backward into a nightmare. I missed Daniel desperately. He wasn't allowed to visit ICU due to strict hospital policies, but I couldn't bring myself to call him. How could I tell him I was sick again without scaring him? Instead, I relied on Liam to update him, praying he wouldn't sense my distress over the phone. Each day blurred into the next, marked only by the rhythmic beeping of monitors and the sterile scent of antiseptic. Fatigue clung to me like a second skin, making even simple tasks feel insurmountable. Worse than the physical toll, though, was the emotional weight. Doubt crept in, whispering cruel truths I tried so hard to ignore. What if you're not strong enough? What if Daniel ends up lost without you? I fought against those thoughts, reminding myself of how far we'd come, but some days, the darkness felt suffocating. One afternoon, Liam arrived with fresh clothes and coffee, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced by concern. "Daniel's been asking about you non-stop," he said quietly. "He drew this for you today." He handed me a crumpled piece of paper covered in crayon scribbles. At first glance, it looked chaotic, a swirl of blues and greens tangled together. But upon closer inspection, I recognized shapes within the mess. Trees, clouds, and a faint outline of what appeared to be 2 figures holding hands. Beneath it, written in shaky block letters, were the words, "Come home soon." Tears welled in my eyes as I traced the drawing with trembling fingers. This wasn't just art, it was a cry for help, a plea from my son who needed me now more than ever. Guilt washed over me, sharp and unrelenting. Here I was, wallowing in self-pity, while Daniel struggled silently on the other side of town. "I need to get better," I whispered to Liam, clutching the drawing to my chest. Not just for me, for him. The turning point came unexpectedly, sparked by something as simple as Daniel's artwork. During one of my rare lucid moments, Liam suggested organizing a small gallery event to showcase pieces created by neurodivergent artists, including Daniel. "It'll raise awareness," he explained enthusiastically, "and maybe even generate funds to support similar initiatives." Initially, I balked at the idea. Who would care about paintings drawn by amateurs? But Liam persisted, pointing out how much joy Daniel derived from sharing his creations. Reluctantly, I agreed to let him explore the possibility. To my astonishment, the response was overwhelming. Local businesses donated space and supplies, volunteers signed up to help organize, and community members expressed interest in attending. When Liam showed me the flyer advertising the event, featuring Daniel's painting of Max chasing a butterfly, I felt a flicker of pride ignite within me. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to dream of a future where Daniel's talents weren't hidden away but celebrated openly. As the date of the gallery approached, excitement buzzed through our makeshift support network. Sarah and Mark helped Daniel prepare new pieces, encouraging him to experiment with different styles and mediums. Meanwhile, Liam coordinated logistics, ensuring everything ran smoothly. Even I found myself contributing, albeit in small ways, writing heartfelt introductions for each artist featured in the exhibition. Watching it all come together gave me a renewed sense of purpose, reminding me why we fought so hard to keep moving forward. On the evening of the event, I sat nervously in a wheelchair near the entrance, watching as guests filed in. Some were familiar faces, friends, former students, neighbors, while others were strangers drawn by curiosity or goodwill. As Daniel stood proudly beside his display, answering questions and sharing stories behind his work, I realized something profound. Art wasn't just a hobby for him, it was a bridge connecting him to the world. And in that moment, surrounded by love and admiration, I knew we'd turned a corner. No matter what challenges lay ahead, we'd face them together, with creativity, resilience, and an unshakable bond. The gallery event was nothing short of magical. Held in a cozy community center auditorium, the space transformed into a vibrant celebration of creativity and resilience. Each wall displayed artwork created by neurodivergent individuals like Daniel, bold colors, intricate details, abstract interpretations, and heartfelt simplicity, all blending together in a kaleidoscope of expression. The room buzzed with energy as visitors moved from piece to piece, asking questions, sharing smiles, and marveling at the talent on display. His growing confidence spilled over into other areas of his life as well. He took on new responsibilities at the community center, mentoring younger kids during arts and crafts activities. Watching him guide others with patience and kindness reminded me of the teacher I used to be and the lessons I'd learned along the way. Daniel wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. And seeing him flourish gave me the courage to keep pushing forward, no matter what challenges lay ahead. By the time spring rolled around, I was finally discharged from the hospital for good. Recovery hadn't been easy. It required months of physical therapy, countless doctor visits, and endless determination, but every step felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. Walking through the front door of our home for the first time in months brought tears to my eyes. Everything looked exactly the same: the worn couch, the stacks of books, the garden bursting with daisies. Yet somehow it felt different. Lighter. Brighter. Daniel greeted me with a hug, so tight it nearly knocked me over. "Welcome home, Mom!" he exclaimed, grinning ear to ear. Overwhelmed by emotion, I pulled him close, breathing in the familiar scent of his hoodie. Home wasn't just a place. It was a feeling, a connection, a bond forged through years of laughter, tears, and unwavering love. As we stood there together, surrounded by reminders of our journey, I knew we'd come full circle. The hardships hadn't broken us, they'd made us stronger. That evening, we sat side by side on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink. Daniel sketched quietly beside me, capturing the moment in his sketchpad. "What are you drawing now?" I asked curiously. Without looking up, he replied, "Our future." Intrigued, I leaned closer, catching glimpses of sprawling fields, towering trees, and two figures holding hands beneath a starry sky. It was breathtakingly beautiful and achingly hopeful. As darkness fell, I wrapped an arm around Daniel's shoulders, pulling him close. "You know, sweetheart," I said softly, "life will always throw curveballs our way. But as long as we stick together, we'll figure it out." "We always do." He nodded solemnly, resting his head against mine. In that moment, surrounded by love and possibility, I allowed myself to dream of what lay ahead. Not with fear or uncertainty, but with faith in the resilience we'd built together. Whatever the future held, we'd face it side by side, hand in hand. The first few days back home were a whirlwind of emotions. Every corner of the house felt both familiar and foreign, as if it had been holding its breath, waiting for us to return. Daniel wandered from room to room, rediscovering his favorite spots: the kitchen table where he painted, the living room couch where we watched movies together, the backyard garden that had grown wild in my absence. He'd bring me little things he found: a smooth stone, a fallen leaf, a stray sock, and place them in my hands like treasures. "For you, Mom," he'd say with a grin. Meanwhile, I tackled the practicalities of settling back into daily life. Laundry piles awaited sorting, bills needed organizing, and the fridge was embarrassingly empty. Thankfully, Neighbors stopped by with casseroles and groceries, offering help without being asked. Mrs. Harper even sent over a cleaning service to tidy up the house while I rested. These gestures reminded me how much our community had rallied around us during my recovery and how far we'd come since those early days of isolation. Still, there were moments when the weight of responsibility threatened to overwhelm me. How could I possibly manage everything on my own? But then I'd glance at Daniel, humming softly as he worked on a new painting, and remind myself, we're not alone anymore. Over time, routines began to fall into place. Physical therapy sessions became part of our morning schedule, followed by quiet afternoons spent gardening or sketching. Daniel resumed volunteering at the community center, eagerly sharing stories about his day over dinner. "Max licked my face today," he declared one evening, laughing. "He likes me now." Evenings were reserved for family movie nights or board games, simple pleasures that grounded us in the present moment. Yet beneath the surface, subtle changes hinted at growth. Daniel took initiative more often, setting the table or tidying up after meals without prompting. He started experimenting with new art techniques, inspired by the friends he'd made in therapy. Watching him embrace independence filled me with pride, but also a bittersweet awareness of how quickly time was passing. My son wasn't a child anymore. He was becoming his own person, carving out a space in the world beyond our bubble. And though letting go terrified me, I knew it was exactly what he needed to thrive. One crisp spring morning, Liam stopped by unexpectedly, carrying a canvas bag filled with supplies. "Thought we could tackle some projects today," he said cheerfully, gesturing toward the garden. Daniel lit up at the suggestion, grabbing his gardening gloves before I could protest. Together, they pruned bushes, planted flowers, and repaired the trellis that had collapsed under winter snow. I sat on the porch, sipping tea and marveling at how easily Liam fit into our lives, not as an outsider, but as an integral part of our support system. Later that afternoon, Liam suggested inviting Daniel to join him at an upcoming art workshop downtown. "It's designed for adults exploring creative careers," he explained. "I think Daniel would enjoy it, and maybe discover new opportunities." The idea thrilled me, though apprehension lingered. Was Daniel ready for such a leap? Could I trust someone else to guide him through this next phase? As if sensing my hesitation, Liam added gently, "You've given him an incredible foundation, Margaret. Now it's time to let him spread his wings." That evening, Daniel presented me with a fresh bouquet of daisies plucked from the garden. "For helping me grow," he said shyly, placing the flowers in my lap. His words caught me off guard, bringing tears to my eyes. "Oh, sweetheart," I whispered, pulling him into a hug. "You're the one who helps me grow." It struck me then how symbiotic our relationship had always been. We weren't just mother and son. We were partners navigating life's challenges together. As weeks turned into months, these small moments added up, strengthening the bond between us. Whether it was sharing laughter over a silly TV show or sitting quietly side by side while Daniel painted, each interaction reinforced the truth I'd known all along. Loving Daniel wasn't a burden, it was a gift. A messy, imperfect, beautiful gift that had shaped me into the person I was meant to be. One rainy afternoon, unable to venture outside due to lingering fatigue, I decided to write letters to the people who'd hurt me most over the years. It wasn't an easy task. Confrontation has never been my strong suit, but something inside urged me to seek closure. I started with Carolyn, carefully choosing each word to convey both forgiveness and boundaries. "Dear Carolyn," I wrote, "your apology meant a lot to me, but your past actions left scars that may never fully heal. Moving forward, I hope we can build a healthier relationship, one based on mutual respect and understanding. Please know that Daniel is my greatest joy, not a burden, and I will always prioritize his well-being above anything else." Next, I addressed old acquaintances and distant relatives who judged or dismissed Daniel throughout his life. Some letters expressed gratitude for their eventual support. Others remained unflinchingly honest about the pain they'd caused. Writing them felt cathartic, like releasing years of pent-up frustration and sadness. When I finished, I tucked the letters into envelopes and sealed them away, not necessarily to send, but as a symbolic gesture of letting go. To my surprise, some recipients responded positively. An estranged cousin reached out to apologize, admitting she'd misunderstood Daniel's needs growing up. Others ignored the letters entirely, choosing silence over reconciliation. But their reactions didn't matter as much as the act itself, choosing peace over bitterness, love over resentment. By addressing the wounds of the past, I freed myself to focus on the future. And as I tucked the final envelope into a drawer, I felt lighter than I had in years, ready to embrace whatever came next. With renewed energy and purpose, Daniel and I threw ourselves into advocacy work, determined to give back to the community that had supported us. We joined local disability rights organizations, attending meetings and workshops to learn how best to amplify marginalized voices. Daniel loved participating in panel discussions, sharing his experiences with humor and grace. "Art makes me happy," he told one audience, holding up a painting of intertwined trees. "And happiness should belong to everyone." Inspired by his courage, I began speaking publicly about our journey, how society often dismisses individuals like Daniel, labeling them burdens instead of celebrating their unique contributions. Schools invited me to address students and teachers, encouraging inclusivity and empathy. At first, public speaking terrified me. I'd spent decades avoiding the spotlight, but Daniel's unwavering support gave me strength. "You're brave, Mom," he assured me before my first talk. Just like me, our efforts rippled outward, sparking meaningful change within the community. Local businesses pledged to hire neurodivergent employees, schools implemented programs promoting inclusivity, and art centers expanded accessibility initiatives. Seeing tangible results fueled our determination to keep pushing forward. Each success reminded us why we fought so hard, not just for ourselves, but for countless families still struggling to find acceptance and opportunity. Through it all, Daniel remained my guiding light. His optimism, resilience, and boundless creativity inspired me to dream bigger, fight harder, and believe in possibilities once thought impossible. Together, we proved that even the smallest acts of kindness and advocacy could create waves of transformation, ripples that carried hope to those who needed it most. On a warm summer evening, Daniel and I sat on the porch watching fireflies dance across the yard. The air smelled of blooming jasmine, and cicadas buzzed lazily in the distance. "Do you remember when we used to chase lightning bugs?" I asked, smiling at the memory. Daniel nodded enthusiastically, his eyes lighting up. "Can we do it again?" he asked. Laughing, I handed him a mason jar and watched as he bounded into the twilight, laughing like a child. In that moment, surrounded by nature's simple beauty, I reflected on everything we'd endured and overcome. From the hospital bed where despair had nearly consumed me to the gallery event that changed our trajectory forever, every step of our journey had led us here, to a place of gratitude, connection, and possibility. Yes, challenges remained. Life rarely offered smooth sailing, but we faced them with tools forged through hardship and strengthened by love. As the stars emerged overhead, I pulled Daniel close, resting my chin atop his head. "Thank you," I murmured, my voice thick with emotion, "for being you, for teaching me patience, courage, and unconditional love. You're my hero, sweetheart." He tilted his head back, grinning. "And you're mine, Mom." Tears blurred my vision as I gazed at the sky, feeling impossibly small yet profoundly connected to something greater than myself. Life hadn't turned out the way I'd envisioned it all those years ago, but perhaps that was the point. Maybe fate truly did have other plans for us. Plans rooted in resilience, compassion, and the unbreakable bond between a mother and her son. Whatever lay ahead, I welcomed it with open arms and a heart full of thanks. Summer gave way to autumn, and with it came one of our most cherished traditions, Daniel's birthday. This year felt different, special in a way that words can't fully capture. Friends, family, and members of the community gathered in our backyard, transforming it into a vibrant celebration of life and love. Strings of fairy lights twinkled overhead, casting a golden glow on tables laden with food, laughter, and handmade decorations. At the center of it all stood Daniel, beaming as he blew out the candles on his cake, a towering masterpiece adorned with painted fondant trees and butterflies. As guests mingled, sharing stories and memories, I couldn't help but marvel at how far we'd come. Once dismissed as a burden, Daniel now commanded admiration and respect from everyone around him. Parents approached me, thanking me for inspiring them to see their own children differently. Teachers expressed gratitude for the advocacy work we'd done, crediting it with sparking change in classrooms across town. And through it all, Daniel remained blissfully unaware of the impact he'd made. To him, this was simply a party, a chance to celebrate with people who loved him deeply. After dinner, Daniel surprised me with a gift wrapped in crinkled brown paper, the same kind he'd used for the bouquet months earlier. "Open it!" he urged excitedly, bouncing on his toes. Inside was a painting unlike any he'd created before. The canvas depicted two figures standing beneath an oak tree, its branches stretching skyward like arms reaching for the heavens. Beneath it, written in bold letters, were the words, "Together forever." Tears streamed down my face as I hugged him tightly. "It's perfect," I whispered, choking back emotion. "Thank you." Later that night, after guests had departed and the yard lay quiet once more, I hung the painting above the fireplace. It wasn't just art. It was a promise, a testament to the unbreakable bond between us. Whatever challenges lay ahead, we'd face them together, hand in hand, guided by the love that had carried us through every storm. In the weeks following Daniel's birthday, I began writing a memoir, a project inspired by countless conversations with friends and strangers alike. They'd encouraged me to share our journey, believing it could inspire others navigating similar paths. At first, I hesitated. Who would want to read about an ordinary woman and her son? But then I remembered the faces of parents I'd met along the way, tired, hopeful, searching for reassurance that they weren't alone. If our story could offer even a glimmer of hope, wasn't it worth telling? So I wrote. I poured my heart onto the page, recounting the highs and lows of raising Daniel, battling illness, and finding strength in unexpected places. Each chapter became a tribute, not just to us, but to everyone who'd supported us along the way. Liam's unwavering dedication, the foster family who welcomed Daniel with open arms, neighbors who rallied around us when we needed them most, even Carolyn, whose apology reminded me that forgiveness is a powerful force. When the book was finally published, I never imagined it would resonate so deeply. Yet within weeks, it climbed bestseller lists, earning praise from critics and readers alike. Letters poured in from across the country, parents thanking me for giving voice to their struggles, teachers adopting the book as required reading, advocates using it to spark conversations about inclusivity and acceptance. One letter stood out in particular. It came from a young man named Ethan who wrote, "Your story made me realize I'm not alone. My mom always told me I was special, but your book helped me believe it." Reading those words brought tears to my eyes. In sharing our journey, I'd found purpose, a legacy of love and resilience that extended far beyond my wildest dreams. And though fame wasn't something I sought, I embraced it as an opportunity to amplify the voices of those often overlooked by society. Together, Daniel and I continued speaking at events, hosting workshops, and championing causes close to our hearts. Through it all, we remained steadfast in our mission, to remind the world that everyone deserves a seat at the table and a chance to shine. On a crisp November morning, I sat on the porch watching Daniel paint in the garden. The air smelled of fallen leaves and wood smoke, and sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows across the grass. He worked quietly, lost in thought as his brush danced across the canvas. Occasionally, he'd glance up, studying the scene before returning to his masterpiece. For a moment, I allowed myself to imagine what his future might hold, a life filled with creativity, independence, and joy. Yet even as pride swelled within me, I couldn't ignore the bittersweet ache of letting go. Daniel wasn't a child anymore. He was a man charting his own course, discovering passions and dreams I couldn't have predicted. Part of me longed to shield him from the world's harshness, to keep him safe within the bubble we'd built together. But another part knew that protecting him meant allowing him to grow, to spread his wings and soar. As I watched him paint, I thought back to the hospital bed where despair had nearly consumed me. Back then, I believed fate had abandoned us, leaving us to navigate life's challenges alone. But now, sitting here surrounded by beauty and possibility, I understood the truth. Fate hadn't abandoned us, it had redirected us. Every setback, every heartbreak, every moment of doubt had led us to this place, a life richer and more meaningful than I'd ever imagined. Daniel finished his painting and held it up proudly. "What do you think, Mom?" he asked, tilting his head curiously. On the canvas was a sprawling oak tree, its branches intertwined like hands reaching out to one another. Beneath it, written in bold letters, were the words, "Stronger together." I smiled, blinking back tears. "I think it's perfect," I said softly. "Just like us." In that moment, I realized something profound. Sometimes, the hardest moments lead us to our greatest triumphs. And sometimes, fate truly does have other plans. For better or worse, they're always worth embracing.